Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's Survey Spatial webinar on employer obligations during lockdown. Our presenter today is Renika Siciliano, who's a director at McCaw Lewis Lawyers, leading the firm's workplace law team. She has worked with a range of clients on employment matters in the authority court and at mediations, advising on personal grievances, health and safety matters, and other disputes. She advises clients on restructures, including redundancies and commercial transfers, and is a regular presenter at numerous EMA conferences and in other forums. Renika also holds a number of external governance roles across the Waikato. So I'll now hand over to you, Renika.
Well, thank you, Jenny, for that introduction, and morena tātou. It sounds like we have a few people on the line, and no doubt everyone has been working through various issues with COVID-19 and will still be working through a number of issues. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge in particular those people that are dealing with this in a very real and personal way. Obviously, a number of people have passed as a result of COVID-19, and our thoughts are with those people and those that have been affected by those, again, in that personal way, beyond the business effects, which I do know that we are all very much experiencing at the moment. And so that is obviously why we're here today, to work through some of those issues from an employment perspective. So I'll just do my best to share my screen right now. And hopefully this is working for us. Jenny will tell me if it is not. We're obviously, I think, 5 weeks now into working from home, or just about 5 weeks for some of us. And so this is about what we're in right now, and preparing for beyond, because appreciate that some people won't be experiencing all of the financial effects right now, but there will be further flow-on effect in the future. So what I wanted to cover off today for you all is generally starting with good faith obligations. Sorry, Jenny's mentioned that I should turn my volume up. So if anybody, she can let me know again if it's not quite working, and I'll speak a little bit louder. Good faith obligations for employers dealing with COVID-19, certainly an important aspect. Then going on to the wage and essential workers leave subsidies. And I appreciate that a number of people on the call will have already applied for wage subsidies. So if there are questions on that front about where to from here, certainly happy to have those discussions. Then working through changes to employee working arrangements, which might end up with restructures or redundancies. So important to be looking at how that works from a legal perspective now, if you are considering that. Then to briefly touch on health and safety, both for those who are currently working in their offices or workplaces or out in the field, and also for those who are working from home. I would like to leave a bit of time at the end for questions and discussion, although I have Slido in front of me, and if there are questions that pop up as we go that are easily answered or appropriately answered during the session, then certainly I will do my best to answer those at the time. Otherwise, we'll save them for the end and go through them. So first up, a number of you would have heard the phrase that employment law is not cancelled or employment law is not on hold. And certainly that's our perspective as well. Whilst there haven't been very many changes to employment laws per se, as there have in other spaces, there have certainly been a lot of developments that affect employers and employees more so than in other spaces. And so it's really important to note that good faith is always the starting point for employment matters. And for those of you who are employers, you will know this in your everyday working space. But in COVID-19, that is certainly the case, and I apologise, just bringing up my Slido again. So this applies to both employers and employees. It needs to be a two-way street. Apologies, my volume is still quiet, it would seem. Please do continue to feed back on that, because I've had a little bit of difficulty this week across different platforms with with my microphone, so I'll hold it here, and apologies for any distraction on that front. So it applies to both employers and employees. So when you're acting with your employer hat on, certainly you need to be acting in good faith. But an example of where we see that employees also need to act in good faith is where the employers are suggesting very reasonable opportunities or other solutions to work through this COVID-19 time. And what that might look like, for example, is an employer proposes reduced working arrangements, reduced working hours, and therefore reduced salaries. And we've had some calls from employees saying, I don't want to accept that. What do I do? Can they force me into that? Well, as I'll get to later, it is difficult for an employer to force an employee into some things. But from an employee perspective, there is an obligation of good faith. And if you know that that is a very genuine proposal, our advice has certainly been to accept that, to understand what exactly it is that's proposed, perhaps ensure that there are a clear terms around that for certainty, but certainly to work with your employer. And in the long run, our hope is that that works both for employers and employees. So I think we're seeing that the COVID-19 situation is certainly demonstrating the need for good faith and how important it is in an employment relationship. So as an employer, how you act in good faith at this time essentially means that you should be maintaining frequent communications. And we say that is absolutely crucial, because the more that you communicate as an employer to explain what is going on, where the thinking is at, and how COVID-19 is impacting your business, the more that your employees will hopefully be more open to considering those alternative working arrangements or understanding the mechanisms that you need to put in place as employers to ensure business continuity. And that is key throughout all of this, isn't it? Ensuring that at the end, business can carry on or hopefully get back to some kind of normal. So employers, as part of good faith, should also consider their staff as a crucial part of considering the business impacts. So I know a lot of you will have been working through a number of financial forecasts and remodeling as all of the government announcements come through, and certainly as the announcement regarding a move to level 3 next week came through, there would have been more financial remodeling and working through what this means for your business. So consider your staff as part of that, not just as a number. And I'm sure many of you are doing that, because in practice your staff are your business. But certainly we're seeing that for a number of employers, that it's not just about the numbers. And then, as I've spoken about, working with employees to find solutions, because there are many out there. This is not a normal time, and the solutions will not be straight out of a packet, I guess. So if we move on to the wage subsidy, and again, I appreciate that a number of you would have already applied for this and possibly received it and be implementing it or utilising it. The key purpose of the wage subsidy is to support employers in continuing to pay their employees and fundamentally keeping jobs through all of this, and in particular through the lockdown and through the restrictions on working conditions at the various alert levels. So if you have applied, you'll know that employers need to have had a 30% drop in actual revenue or a predicted 30% drop in revenue for any month. And if you haven't applied and you're thinking about how that works for you, that is a 30% actual or predicted drop for any month through to June, based on the financial figures from last year. So take May last year. What was your revenue in May 2019? What do you think your revenue for May 2020 will be? If there's a 30% predicted drop, then you do qualify on that front to seek the wage subsidy. You then need to keep your employees for the 12-week duration of the subsidy if you've applied for a subsidy for them. If you don't, or for example, if someone leaves during that period, resigns, then you will need to repay that portion of the wage subsidy that applies to that employee or which was sought for that employee. You also need to endeavour to keep employees on at 80% of their hours or pay. That was changed early on in the piece because of the lockdown and the government appreciating that in a lockdown with significant restrictions on working arrangements, some employers simply cannot open or operate and therefore cannot keep their employees on at 80% of their hours or pay. So that's why that is best endeavours criteria. And you do need to have consent of all the named employees. So from a very practical perspective, and for those of you who have already applied, if you haven't done this, I'd suggest that you just go back and quickly look over your records because it's really important that if you do calculate a 30% drop either in actual or in predicted revenue, you've got a clear record of how you came to that because you'll know that the government has been essentially trusting the declarations that have come through for the wage subsidy and processing the wage subsidy applications on that basis. So that means that you should keep track of those. If you have made certain assumptions in predicting a 30% drop in revenue, then do keep a track of those, whether it's via an internal email amongst your directors or owners, or whether it's just a piece of paper where you've written those comments and scribbled some numbers on a piece of paper. Whatever it is that made you satisfied that you can make that declaration and give that declaration, that's fine. Keep that. Also keep track of any mitigation steps that you've taken, as that is part of the declaration as well. So if you were talking to your bank, which I know a number of people would be talking to their banks, talking to their accountants, understanding what other measures might be available and generally in addition to the wage subsidy, then keep those emails as well. Because if the auditors come knocking, and I think there's been some media around that in the last day or so around audits and people having to return their funds, what will be important is the information which you based your declaration on and what information you had in front of you at that time to satisfy the declaration. I do note that the wage subsidy is a lump sum payment to employers. So when some people have been calling and asking how do they use their wage subsidy and does it always have to be passed on in full or recorded on pay slips, I think it is best practice to keep records of how you are applying the lump sum payment and the wage subsidy for each staff member. But fundamentally, it is a payment that goes to the employer, again, to help the employer keep the business afloat and help keep employees in their seats. Or should I say behind their desks or wherever they may be. So again, do keep that record of how and when you are applying the wage subsidy. And importantly, where there's a subsidy only payment, then you do need to make sure that the full amount of the wage subsidy is being passed on to the employee. And the only exception to that is where the employee might earn less or does earn less than the wage subsidy that they have been that you've been provided in relation to them. So you pay the lesser of the two. They're either getting their normal weekly pay or they're getting the $5.85. For the essential workers leave subsidy, this was a replacement for the earlier leave subsidy. And it's really about supporting employers to continue to pay workers in essential services who can't be at work if they're at risk, in particular if they have COVID-19 or are caring for someone with COVID-19. We might see that this leave subsidy changes what it looks like as we move out of alert level 4 into alert level 3, but at the moment this subsidy is still available. And it's essentially the same criteria as the wage subsidy with the 30% actual or predicted drop in revenue, but it only applies for 4 weeks because it is a leave subsidy. And at the end of that 4 weeks, you can apply for a further 4 weeks of the leave subsidy. Again, the full amount of that subsidy must be passed on to the employee whom you're receiving the subsidy for, unless they earn less. And as an employer, you can only apply for one or other of the subsidies for each employee. So you may have a wage subsidy for 49 staff, and for one employee, you have the leave subsidy because they may be at risk or may unfortunately have contracted COVID-19. So there is a question here around, does a subsidy only payment require employee consent? And that's a perfect segue into the next slide, which is the fact that it's not a matter of telling an employee that things are changing. So essentially, yes, a subsidy only payment does require employee consent, unless there is a situation where you simply cannot open and you have no work, so there is nothing that that employee can do, then it's a matter of indicating, explaining, and working through with them what that employment situation looks like. Ideally, you should be getting written agreement on the fact that there is no work for this period of time, and therefore there is no ability from an employer perspective to make payment for hours. So then you may say, of course, the wage subsidy has been obtained, and suggest to them that they are on a wage subsidy only arrangement. There has been a lot of talk about whether employees are ready, willing, and able to work where there is a lockdown. And if you've been reading various channels, you will see that amongst employment lawyers, there are different views. Some would say that government restrictions mean that an employee is ready, willing, and able to work, but it's the government who stepped in and said that the employer can't offer them that work. My personal legal opinion is that an employee is not ready, willing, and able to work where they are prevented from doing so by a lockdown. So they might be ready and willing, but unfortunately they're not able to, and therefore that changes things because they can't come into work, they can't do their job if there's no option of doing it remotely. And therefore you'd just have that discussion to say, look, we have no work, you're not able to come in and do your job, and therefore this is what we are proposing, that there is a subsidy only payment being made. Outside of that, where an employee can work remotely or can continue doing some work, but you need them to essentially reduce hours to sustain the business and ensure continuity going forward, our advice is certainly that those changes do require written agreement in the first instance. You can't simply say to someone, look, tomorrow, don't worry about coming into work. And I think we would have seen some articles around that, other quite big businesses saying that all their staff are not coming into work from tomorrow. That's been how it's been reported anyway. And that is, in my view, not acceptable and would give rise to a personal grievance. So there's another question here, is it an agreement or a notification to the staff? And I think that depends. So if it is that there is no work, you cannot operate, there are no options. For example, if you run a retail store, I appreciate that no one on this call probably will, but that is a very clear example of where you need people in the store. And if they cannot operate online at all, then at the moment, that would be a notification because you cannot work. There is nothing that they can do. If, however, you have people that could potentially do some parts of their job and continue working from home, but you've made the decision that they won't be working and that hours will be stopped, that's a different situation. And so I would say that is not a notification, but rather that's an agreement situation. So you are notifying people of the position, and that comes back to that communication issue, but you are getting their agreement to any changes. And in my experience in the queries that have been coming through, where employers have provided more information than they would in any other circumstance around the effects of COVID-19 on the business, those agreements have been much more forthcoming, because people understand that it is essentially a matter of them agreeing to changes or potentially them losing their jobs. And I'll get to those issues of restructure and redundancy shortly. We've just noted there on the slide that the changes could be very unique. We've seen people making arrangements whereby there's a mix of reduced hours, annual leave taken, and changes to tasks. So, for example, you may have people working from home who can't do all the normal things that they would. They can't go out into the field, but certainly there's enough work for them to be doing from home, preparing reports and engaging with clients remotely. So they might have, for example, 3 days worth of work instead of 5. And you might agree with them that they drop their hours to 4 days a week. In terms of an employment sense, they're now working 4 days a week, but they take one of those days as annual leave. So therefore, they are working 3 days a week, taking a 4th day as annual leave, and effectively getting paid for 4 days. That means, again, that you are using up some of that annual leave entitlement for them that you then don't have to worry about at the end of all of this. And you might, of course, agree that there are some changes to tasks needed so that there are other jobs that people are doing, particularly, of course, your receptionists and people that are very much based in a client-facing way or an administrative way that is not needed to the same level at the moment. People might agree that they take unpaid leave and simply receive the wage subsidy in full. People might, where you don't have the wage subsidy, people might agree that they take unpaid leave full stop, because at the end of this, they would rather have a job than be on the unemployment list. And certainly if those are things that you agree with your employees to make this work, then that is fine. I've got a couple more questions that I'll just look through at the moment. The first one, can employers notify staff that pay will be reduced to 80% if staff are still able to work 100% of their hours remotely? So if you need to reduce staff to 80% for financial reasons to ensure the business can continue, then again, that is a change that needs to be discussed and agreed. So I know the wage subsidy refers to and keeping people on at 80% of their pay and hours, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can automatically all just cut our employees' time and wages to 80%. Again, that's an agreement matter. Someone here has asked, yes, taking sick leave an allowable option if the staff member is not sick. And my view is no, that's not viable for them to be able to take their sick leave unless they fall into that criteria. So they would need to be sick, have a loved one that they are caring for who is sick. But I would say, though, that sick leave can cover mental health issues. And if you have staff members who are struggling and just need a bit of a mental health day, then that would come under that sick leave category. But I certainly wouldn't recommend that any employers talk to their employees about utilising sick leave as a way of getting through this to use up that entitlement. Of course, what that means is that later in the year, when they might get back out into the big wide world and do get unwell, then you're without a staff member and they are on unpaid sick leave. A couple of other questions coming through. What if there is no work for a discipline, but the employee does not agree to a reduction to the equivalent of the subsidy? And so that I probably will address in a couple of slides' time, and please do ask the question again if I don't cover off that in full. Another question here, which I may not be able to answer, but I'll read it out so that it hasn't gone unnoticed. I know that the wage subsidy is not taxable for GST, but is it considered to be income and therefore taxable? And I'm sorry, I'm always very, very wary of giving tax advice because by no means am I a tax expert. But so I will decline to answer that one. But what I could perhaps do is feedback through Jenny and find out that answer. But I would certainly suggest and recommend talking to your accountants on the money ins and outs of all of this. So in terms of changing work arrangements, as we've been discussing, while I really encourage you to find unique arrangements, those arrangements can't be less than the minimum legal requirements. And that's, in some regards, a little bit unique in the employment space because there are so many minimum legal requirements and entitlements for employees. So one big one is that employers can only require or essentially force an employee to take leave with 14 days notice. Certainly you can agree that from tomorrow, 5 of your staff are taking their annual leave if they would like to do that and are comfortable with doing that. But if you get to a situation where you need to force your employees to take leave and have some sort of shutdown period, then you need to give 14 days notice. And unfortunately, there's no workaround for that other than agreement. And just at a very practical level, and any lawyer you've ever talked to has probably told you that you need to ensure a very tight paper trail and keep recording things. So I'm going to say no different. Record your arrangements carefully and in writing. Some of the things you should consider is whether any variation to hours is a fixed term. So for many, you will just need to change working arrangements for the period of a lockdown or perhaps through to the end of alert level 3. And if that's the case, then that might be the end point. The contract is varied down to 80% of hours or down to 50% of hours in pay, perhaps, if that's agreed, through to the end of alert level 3. You can have a fixed term variation that ends on an event rather than a date, and that will save you continually varying or communicating in a formal way with your staff to change their work arrangements. If, for example, you may have said this is varied through until whatever the date was, is it 22 April, where some people might have thought that was the end of our 4-week lockdown. And as we know, now the lockdown ends at 11:59 p.m. on Monday. So I would suggest just really looking carefully at how you word those things and what the intention is. Of course, sometimes the arrangements might be permanent if you agree those, and you might permanently drop a staff member down to 80% of their job by agreement. So that won't be a fixed term variation, that will be a straightforward variation that is permanent. A lot of people have been calling saying, how do I then record all these variations? Do I have to get someone to sign a new employment agreement? What does that look like? And I certainly appreciate that signing documents, especially in a physical way, can't be done very easily right now. We don't all have printers and things at home. So most IEAs refer to variations being done in writing and agreed between the parties. In that case, I would just recommend that it be done in an email. And if you can, refer to the specific provisions of the IEA that allow for a variation and which you are changing. For example, you might be changing clause 3.0, which is the hours of work, and you might be also changing a provision in Schedule A, which is the level of remuneration. So refer to those changes so that it's clear both for you and the employee. And at the end of all this, you're not then battling personal grievances around how that wording was set out. a request, yes, around the tax purposes. And Jenny, I might just ask you to keep me accountable on that one, and make sure that I do come back. I certainly will endeavour to, but I appreciate that in the next 30 minutes I could forget that tax question. So Jenny, thank you for noting that for me. There is a question here. I have a 5-year-old child. My employer has insisted I work full-time from Tuesday. The after-school care for my child does not open until the alert level drops to level 2. Employer has suggested family support, not always possible. What rights do I have by refusing to work outside school hours? Really good question, and one that we are hearing a lot, both from both sides of the coin, from employers and employees, because as always, these things do affect both people. So from an employer perspective, I would certainly encourage flexibility around parents that need to continue to work. And we all appreciate that in alert level 3, that those who need to send their children back to school can send their children back to school. But certainly I'm in the same position, no after school care at this stage. So that is really difficult. And starting point from a strictly legal perspective is that employees do need to be ready, willing and able to work for the period set out in their employment agreement. And for example, that might be Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. So when I said earlier that employment law is not cancelled, that unfortunately is the same now that we are needing people to go back to work. So employees do need to be ready, willing and able to work for those hours that they are contracted to. And I appreciate that family support's not always possible, but essentially if you are refusing to work outside school hours, then I guess at the very extreme level, your employer might have the discussion around disciplinary action or breaches of your employment agreement because you're not working the hours needed. I would hope that that is not the case, and that there might be a workaround which involves reduced pay, certainly for a fixed period of time. But what I would recommend employees in that situation is certainly to be flexible as well. When you're expecting flexibility from your employers, you need to be flexible as well. And I would say that I think it is, whilst certainly unfortunate, it is not the correct legal position to take, that you should be entitled to be paid for all hours, that including those that you are not able to work. And sorry, that certainly wasn't what was indicated in the question, that there was that expectation, but I just wanted to be clear on that front. Another question, in a time when all ideas are good ideas to consider, certainly agree with that, and we need innovative responses and an all hands to the pump attitude, can you provide guidance in relation to the typical employment clause of any other tasks reasonably required, rather than a variation to the employment agreement? Absolutely. I think that should be, if you have that clause, which I suspect 98% of you do have a clause like that in employment agreements, use it. And I think that doesn't necessarily require a variation unless the employee is no longer doing the core job. So if I use the example of having a receptionist who will have probably a varied range of tasks, if you're now saying your job description looks like X and has these 10 tasks in it, we need you to still keep doing the top 5, but obviously you can't do the next 5 because they involve cleaning the reception desk, etc. We're going to top up with some other tasks. I see no issue with that and no need for a formal variation to the job. If you are asking your receptionist to do something that which might be absolutely in no way envisaged by her employment agreement, and might be something expected of someone at a much higher pay grade, for example, then I think that is when you need to have the discussion around how to record it in a variation. But I mean, when it comes down to it, again, innovative ideas are needed, and both parties need to be talking around how that can work. So I think those variations around tasks, if they're close to or kind of within the realm of what is fair and reasonable, then I don't think that is necessarily a restructure or redundancy, which we're just coming to now. So I do appreciate that the subsidies are there to help keep jobs, as I've said, but we know that this isn't always possible, and it's happening across the country in many, many fields that people are needing to make people redundant. And certainly, and unfortunately, sadly, those are a lot of the calls that I'm getting at the moment. How do we prepare for this? It might not be right now, but we are considering redundancies, and we need to work through how to do that. So any forced changes are essentially a form of restructure. And with any restructure, as some of you may be aware of, employers need to have a genuine reason for that restructure. That's fundamental. You can't just do it because today you think you want to change the look of the office, and that involves having 5 less people, because there are obviously minimum legal entitlements for employees. And you also need to carry out a proper consultation process seeking feedback. But for those of you who have carried out a restructure process, you will know that, or you will have heard from your lawyers that that's not a super straightforward process, and certainly not a quick process, because of that consultation element and needing to demonstrate the genuine reasons for the restructure. I think under COVID-19, though, this process will be reasonably tailored, because that aspect of genuine reasons is already essentially at the forefront of everyone's minds. COVID-19 provides us with a much easier starting point for those discussions, because uh, most of our employees, although I appreciate not all, do understand in a general sense what this is meaning for our economy, and they will appreciate that sometimes there are simply no alternatives but to cut the head count. And so I would just say that you just do need to remember your good faith obligations as an employer if you're in that situation. Be a fair and reasonable employer. Ensure that you are speaking with your staff, because certainly for all the people that I've been talking with, the redundancies are in no way about wanting to get rid of people, but simply having to reduce costs because of reduced workloads, and not being able to carry that if they are to keep their business afloat. And the other thing there, just considering your wage subsidy declaration, whereby you will have committed to keeping your staff that you're receiving the wage subsidy for, you will have committed to keeping them for the duration of that 12 weeks. So just reflect on what it was that you put in the declaration and how you will address that. I do see there are a couple of questions coming through. I'll just go through them in order, so I'm not sure when they came through. Too often people go to work sick as they cannot afford not to, and hence the risk of infecting the rest of the staff. Thoughts on this, please? So certainly people should be taking sick leave if they are sick, and I think the threshold, or what we might deem as being sick, is significantly lowered at this stage. I certainly know for our staff at Lewis, and for those that we're working with on policies and processes for level 3 and into alert level 2, our advice has been, if someone is sick at all, they do not come into the office. And that has to be, I think, the approach for everyone, and that is consistent with the government guidelines and directives. So in that regard, obviously, if they can work remotely, then I would recommend that you have a process around what that looks like, and working from home, or working from home policy, and a policy saying that you cannot come into work if you have the slightest cough, or if anyone in your immediate, in your bubble is ill. And I think that's fine, and you can use sick leave in that space, certainly. There's another follow-up question here. I suggest this is the time to rethink sick leave provisions, perhaps at legislative level, but for each employer to think about it, i.e. people should not be at work when they are sick. The statutory sick leave provisions are minimal in many, if not most, employment contracts. Follow-up coming. So yes, definitely. Sorry, I may have read those out of order, sorry. But that is absolutely the case. And you can give people additional sick leave, and that can be discretionary, and it doesn't need to be in their employment agreements. And that comes back to doing what is right, being a fair and reasonable employer. And if you can provide sick leave, or if you can provide other tasks to keep them productive and working at home while they're slightly under the weather, then I would certainly recommend doing that if you can. Another question here, if staff are reduced to 80% salary and hours, that is may only be a 20% reduction in chargeable hours. How does that reconcile with the 30% drop in revenue that needs to be proved for an audit trail? That's a really good question, and I will say it's certainly one that even at a personal level for our firm we have been working through, and it's definitely hard because I think the reality is that, unfortunately, there might be a 20% drop in what you are paying people, their wages, their hours, but the reality may be that they are actually doing a lot less chargeable hours than normal because quite simply the work isn't coming through. So they may be doing more administrative tasks or getting their digital office tidy, doing those tasks that we've all, I guess, put on the back shelf for a little while. So I think that is just a reality and something that you need to work through for yourself, for management, and then potentially talk to your accountants about, because certainly what I'm seeing is though even though you take that 20% cut, there's still a much larger financial hit in reality, and often you are paying your staff for slightly more than they are actually doing, and that comes with that notion of being a good boss and flexibility. What I will just note again though is that the 80% one is not a guaranteed reduction, so it's not an automatic reduction down to 80% of wages or hours, but also that you can reduce more if you absolutely need to. If you don't have the work there and you need to reduce, for example, some staff, perhaps admin staff, down to 50%, then you can do that, and that then might reduce your revenue if there are other tasks not able to be done. So if we move to health and safety, which certainly in COVID-19 generally is an important issue, and one which certainly a number of people have been trying to work through, whether they are working from home or still working in a physical sense in the office or out in the field or in their essential services. We know from the Prime Minister, from the government, that the focus under Alert Level 3 is now moved from essential services to the safe provision of services. And so what I would say is that we just do need to be aware of all of the government guidelines and WorkSafe guidance if you are back in your workspace or out in the field, carrying out valuations, etc. And I say this because if an auditor, if a WorkSafe inspector comes around and looks at your practices, then they will be asking you whether you were aware of this government directive or that government directive. Have you seen the guidance on our website as WorkSafe? Because that is certainly what they do in my experience, and for anyone who's had the unfortunate experience of having PIN notices, etc., served on them. So the WorkSafe guidance, and I would encourage you all to have a quick look at their website if you haven't already, does recommend that you prepare a COVID-19 safety plan for your return back to work. And as part of that, it asks that you consider 7 questions that are listed on their website. And those are questions like, are there any risks arising from restarting your business or restarting aspects that have been shut down during alert level 4, asking you how you'll manage those, asking, as we mentioned around the sick leave, how will you know that your staff are well, and how do you manage any sicknesses or risks that the workers themselves bring. And I think having that COVID-19 safety plan, it doesn't need to go anywhere, it doesn't need to be submitted to WorkSafe, but having thought through those things, one is a very practical thing which you're probably all doing in reality anyway. But again, as lawyers with our paper trails that we love so much, I would suggest that you put it in writing and do have it somewhere. And if you can, share it with your staff members. Certainly, we've had some questions around what happens if an employee breaks or flouts the rules and doesn't act in accordance with government guidance around isolation and other measures. So in that situation, I would certainly recommend that employers have that as part of their policies, as part of their safety plans, and share it with their staff, so that if that is the situation, one, so that employees are aware of it in the first instance, but two, if they do break any rules and you are concerned about that as an employer, you can then treat it as a disciplinary issue if you do really need to. Obviously, we'd hope that doesn't get to that situation at the moment, because a disciplinary procedure is surely just one more thing that you do not need at this stage. But if you need to, then you can. And for those working from home, just to flag that health and safety obligations do still apply both to employers and employees. And we know that home setups won't be perfect, and some people will unfortunately need to work at their kitchen table and then transfer it back into a dining table for the evening. But you do need to be pragmatic and help your staff in their home setups if you're in that situation. And I would recommend in that regard perhaps a simple survey, and there are some online, or if you'd like one, please feel free to contact me. I have a template that I can send out, and it can be tailored as needed. Suggest sending out just a quick survey for your staff about their working from home setup to identify any particular pain points or things that you can suggest they improve on. Obviously being pragmatic, because it's not easy in this lockdown to get all of the tools that you need, but it might become easier in alert level 3, and therefore you might be able to do a little bit more to help people manage, whether it's in a physical sense in terms of their safety and setup, something as simple as sending out multi-plugs, because some of us, if you're like me, realised that you didn't have as many multi-plugs as you perhaps needed to have 2 people working from home and a child on devices for school. Something as simple as that, or in the mental space, helping people expand their bubble in a safe way and providing that support. And again, employees need to do their bit too, by responding to those surveys, by having reasonable expectations of their employers, but first and foremost looking after their own safety and well-being to the extent that they can. So that was my spiel essentially across all of those issues. I know we've addressed a number of questions as we've gone through, but if there are any other questions that people wanted to pop through, certainly more than happy to answer them in the few minutes that we have left. Otherwise, Jenny, I'll hand back to you.
Great, thank you, Renika. That was very, very informative, and I'm sure that our members got a lot out of that. Just coming back to that question about the government wage subsidy and it being part of the employee's income for tax purposes. Look, unfortunately, we can't advise you on that because we don't know the answer. So, as Renika suggested earlier, it's probably best for you to contact your own accountant just to get that information. So I'm sorry we couldn't give you the answer to that. To all of our members on this webinar, it has been recorded today and it is available to rewatch on the Survey Spatial YouTube channel, and doesn't look like there's any more questions that have come through. So thanks once again, Renika, and thanks once again to our members for tuning into this webinar.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.